I've been using Godot as my primary game engine for several months now, and I'll say right off the bat that Godot is a great engine, but it's certainly not perfect. So I would like to talk about the ups and downs of using it based on my experience. This is 100 Hours of Godot. I'm saying this right now, and I'll say it again. Many of the things I criticize are already being changed for Godot 4.0. But this isn't a review of what Godot will be, this is a summary of what it has been in the time that I've been using it. So some of the things I mention may be out of date or uninformed, especially in the case of issues I encountered that I was unable to solve. Godot has a lot going on, and I haven't discovered all of its secrets. Far from it. If something I stated isn't accurate or you know a workaround to a problem I've encountered, please share it in the comments, both for clarification to those watching and for me, who needs tech support. It should also be mentioned that although this isn't specifically a Unity versus Godot video, Unity is my main point of reference for game engines, so there will be a lot of comparisons to that program. And just like Godot, I don't know everything about Unity. Remember, there is no perfect game engine, all of them have their pros, their cons, and their niches. And finally, I am not a professional game developer. I am not a professional programmer. I'm a guy who picked up a hobby a few years ago and wants to share his progress and thoughts online. I only hope that this video is helpful to those less experienced folks like myself deciding whether or not to learn Godot, and is at the very least entertaining to everyone else. So with that out of the way, let's begin with a brief history of how I got here. I downloaded Godot over a year ago and pretty quickly discovered that I liked it, but I was very focused on Unity at the time. I had been learning it since 2018, but it was only in late 2020 that I really started to get a feel for it, so I thought it was a bit early to be jumping ship. But in the summer I tried out a few different game engines, researched some others, and soon found myself once again intrigued by Godot. Simultaneously trying to learn Godot, Unity, and Unreal Engine wasn't working out for me. I was hardly learning anything. So I put everything else on hold and decided to give Godot a proper shot. I figured that 100 dedicated hours would be enough time to figure out if the engine was really for me. 100 hours took a long time, especially given that I was still in high school and had other hobbies. But I've put in the work, tutorials, prototypes, game jams, a couple game remakes, and some small experiments in VR. The whole time I have logged my thoughts on the learning process and the differences between Godot and previous engines that I have used. So that's a summary that leads me to where we are today. We tend to overlook the problems of things we deal with on a regular basis. So although some of the things I comment on may not seem particularly notable to a longtime Godot user, they certainly will be to a rookie. Let's get into Godot itself, starting with the initial appeal of the program. Godot is cool. And that's not some generic comment, that's an apt description of the energy that it radiates. Other engines may have a vast portfolio or a detailed resume to back them up, but Godot showed up for its job interview in a slick suit and a charming gleam in its eyes. It opens fast, and it loads even faster. Its icons are perfectly sized, its labels are succinct, and that navy blue not only soothes the eyes, but ensures that its windows never get lost in a busy desktop, perfect for my window jumping workflow. When I imagine Creative Suite user interfaces, the first programs that come to my mind are Blender pre-2.8 or Unity. So to see a program that prioritizes making its UI not disgusting is really cool. Objects are all color-coded and have their own unique symbols. Adding in objects doesn't feel like filling out a spreadsheet, but rather digging through a Lego bin. I'm not saying it doesn't take itself seriously as a game engine, but rather that it respects itself as a modern application. The level of polish put into its UI is commendable. It feels deceptively simple to use. I scan the interface and feel like I understand everything. In Unity, I'm desperately trying to avoid making eye contact with any option that I don't already know. Godot makes me feel smart, Godot makes itself look good, and Godot does it all expeditiously. I chose Godot because it's cool, and some might say that a more logical draw would be the open source nature, the improved workflows, lack of licensing, null cost, or the fact that Godot doesn't need to shell out billions on unnecessary tech to impress investors. But for me, that reasoning came later on. In the very beginning, I was just picking the coolest guy to have on my team. But being cool doesn't mean you'll be a good player. So let's see how Godot rolls. Godot doesn't have the same workspace arrangement options that Unity has. Besides a few toggles and sliders for adjusting menus, it's very static. Godot is a single window program. Every menu, even those that seem to pop up, are really just an overlay within Godot's little bubble. While in many ways this allows Godot to be very predictable and organized, this does hugely limit the ways in which it can be personalized. And since you have your files, scenes, 3D and 2D workspaces, and code editor all in one window, it can seem to be a very cramped workflow for the first while. But there's a rhythm eventually. Dragging in assets, opening a tab for the asset, creating a script, jumping back and forth between windows, it's got a flow to it. And you want your work to have a flow. It's called good workflow. One thing that I've always really liked about Unity was how you could manipulate the scene while you were in game. Move things around, change up variables, the whole shebang. It's really helpful for quickly testing things out without restarting the program. Godot does sort of have this in the form of the remote scene. You can change variables and positions and whatnot, but it's strictly through the inspector. You can't see the changes happening in the scene view with all the gizmos and whatnot. It's not the end of the world, of course, but it is a feature that I miss. If you want to debug in Godot, get ready to use the print debug method a lot. Also, get ready to see output overflow print less text a lot too. Godot's reset buttons are surprisingly useful. Almost anytime you change a variable, the little icon pops up beside it. This is great for encouraging experimentation and exploration of new features without worrying about trying to find the default value when it messes up your whole project. Clarity is huge in Godot. It's always clear which labels are connected to which inputs, which variables are or aren't representing their default value, which toggles are on or off, which nodes have scripts, what family a node is from, the visibility of nodes, and on and on. I say as I run out of things to go on and on about. Point is, Godot has clarity. It's communicative, transparent if you will. So despite its compact menu, I always know where I am and what I'm looking at. That's preferable to me. Speaking of preferable, what on earth are those nodes I was talking about? All game engines have their own special ways in which they work. Unity has mono behaviors, Unreal Engine has blueprints, GameMaker has a $100 a year subscription fee, and Godot has nodes. I was most familiar with Unity, and in Unity everything is a game object. The way you define what each game object does is through components that you can add to your heart's content. So when I switched to Godot, where you can only have one script per object, I figured they'd pin me for a fool. But after a few tutorials and adjustments to my game structure, I found that in many ways, this, quote, workaround is far easier to deal with. While yes, there is an appeal to creating an all-powerful game object monster to throw into a project like a wild science experiment, by using Godot's specific child-parent-sibling structure, commonly known as a family, it forces you to properly organize your hierarchical structures in a more readable fashion. Paired with the identifiable symbols, each family begins to represent an organized team of little node people. Mesh? Check. Collider? Check. Camera? Check. Physics? Check. We've got a player, everybody. By cutting out the concept of components for the most part, each node gets treated equally, and we no longer require weird specifications like get component as opposed to get child. Though it does mean you'll end up with a lot more random nodes whose only purpose is to house a script. Nodes also replace Unity's distinction between prefabs and scenes. Loading in a new level is the same as deleting one node and adding another, which is really helpful for separating code into more modular pieces. That way you wouldn't face the classic Unity struggle of synchronizing changes between multiple scenes. I'd have one main node that I'd call world or game or something, and it would have all the boilerplate in there 24/7, and then I would make the level nodes children of the world and swap them in and out as I please. Structure like this is certainly possible in Unity, if you ignore the concept of scenes plural altogether, but Godot sees this as the default workflow, and not something you may or may not discover. Jumping between the world node, the player node, the level node, and the random button node is instant, intuitive, and feels conducive to the workflow. In Unity, if I make something into a prefab, I'm probably done with it. Opening up a prefab in Unity feels like lifting a rotting log. Godot is modular with a capital M. It takes some getting used to, but it's darn good. So what's it like to code these modules? I'm not a big Python fan. I personally like curly brackets and semicolons and clear variable types and all that stuff that makes coding in C# slower to write, but far easier to read. GDScript, Godot's custom scripting language, is very similar to Python in that way, but I won't harp on GDScript syntax too much because A, I haven't used Python in a while, and B, a lot of it is just personal preference. Also, yes, C# is a language that can be used with Godot if you download the mono version, but C# is way less popular than GDScript in the Godot space, so finding engine-specific help is a lot more tedious, and I don't have the guts to deviate from the norm. Much as I prefer C# syntax, switching was not as big of an issue as I presumed. I used it, I got used to it, I got over it, and now I hardly think about it. But I do care about how the coding side of things interacts with the engine side of things, because it isn't always super silky smooth. First, the workspace. The coding tab is a tab. It can't be opened to a separate window or put on another monitor. You can connect Godot to an external code editor and download some autofill modules for it, but that kinda takes away from Godot's all-in-one functionality, and I was too lazy to set it up. But I quite like how the built-in editor works, and would really love it if I could simply right-click the script tab and toggle between connected and windowed mode. It can sometimes get disorienting when I'm trying to work quickly and I'm switching between tabs and script nodes and my eyes are darting around trying to find the thing I'm looking for. Again, the more I did it, the better at it I got, and I don't think about it much anymore. But it does still make it a little confusing at times, especially with the way it automatically opens and switches between scripts without making it clear that that's what it's doing. But more on the coding side of things. Godot has autofill, or IntelliSense, or whatever it's called. It kinda sucks. In Unity, or at least Visual Studio Community, as soon as you start typing, it gives you a full list of possible methods, variables, and other junk. It was always clear exactly what each option was, what you could do with it, and even what you shouldn't do with it in the case of deprecated entries. Godot doesn't tell you what's what. Sometimes it's implied through its naming, but if you're not sure, it won't give you a straight answer. I've had plenty of cases where it autofills what I assume to be a variable, only to find out in testing that it was actually a method. Not that I would have known, it doesn't automatically add the brackets. But this is all assuming autofill actually gives you an answer to begin with. You may get a list, for sure, but it's organized with a lot of the most common pieces of code either buried beneath or not present at all. Several times I've wondered, why doesn't Godot have this obvious helpful feature, only to find out from online forums that it does, but it would have never told you as such. Small typos will instantly vanquish all similar results, and sometimes I have to rewrite an entire line of code just to get autofill to show up again. And trying to get code autocomplete from another node is awful. When referencing a node such as player, I expect to use player reference dot something for it to recommend some of the variables that the player contains. Sometimes it does, but most of the time it doesn't. Whether the player scene has to be open, or the specific instance has to be selected, or the accompanying script has to be open, I'm not sure. Sometimes it autofills, and sometimes it doesn't. The way you get other nodes kind of sucks to begin with. You're forced to use a specific chain of getParent.getParent.getParent.getNode methods to climb all the way up and then back down the node hierarchy. In other engines, you could just make a public reference and drag it in, but the closest thing in Godot is the export variable option. But that's very limited. Best you can do is export a node path, which does not restrict the type of node that can be inputted in the slightest. Also, you can't drag and drop a node in here. You have to click the button and search through the whole hierarchy for the right node. It makes public lists pretty darn unbearable. My best solution was to make an autoload script, which is Godot's version of a singleton, called references to store references to every needed node in the project. I would really like it if Godot had a better built-in way of dealing with this, and maybe it does, but I certainly couldn't find it. Well, till a few days ago, where I was recommended a video demonstrating a future update that fixes part of this problem. See, it's tricky to criticize Godot, because it keeps getting these improvements every other week. Darn Godot, not even letting its issues persist long enough to complain. A lot of this stuff is going to change soon. I want to keep putting that out there, so that I don't scare people away from Godot. But since I am talking about my experience thus far, I think it's fair that I get to nitpick anyway. And complaining's fun! So, while we're at it, here's some more complaints about Godot's scripting. If a built-in method gives you a variable that you can use, such as delta in the process function, it will get mad if you don't use that variable and forget to put an underline in front of it, marking it as unused. Similarly, for methods that return a value, they want you to put it into a variable, and if you aren't using the variable, to put an underline in front of it. It doesn't break the game by any means, but it breaks my heart, and it makes my code look funny. In Unity, if you want to get the position of an object, you would use transform.position, or transform.localPosition depending on world or local space. Pretty reasonable, yeah? So you'd think Godot would have a similar naming convention for these variables, wouldn't you? And Godot does have .position, for 2D nodes at least. And that's a local position. For global position, you need either get or set global position. And in 3D, it's even weirder. Instead of position, you use translation. Again, for local space. And then global translate. Just kidding, that's a method. You need global transform.origin. That's the world space of a 3D object. The forward vector, the direction of the object, Unity's version being transform.forward, is global transform.basis.z. Just kidding, it's negative global transform.basis.z, because the z-axis is backwards, I guess. There was an explanation, but I forgot and don't care. Those are the more notable examples of Godot's weirdly named variables. Again, some of this stuff is changing soon. Other stuff can be changed if people simply request the change or change it themselves. Not me, because I'm afraid of programming at a level lower than scripting, but braver people can, because open source and Godot are just awesome like that. And in the worst case scenario, the reason why something sucks will be justified, and I'll have closure. GDScript is a baby language. I don't mean that as an insult, it's a very new language made by very few people. It's quite literally in its infancy, but despite my many nitpicks and moments of frustration, it's still a very competent language. Overall, I actually enjoy using it. One of its cool features is signals. They're like Unity events, but better. They're little emitted signals that communicate when something has happened with a node, like a timer running out, an object being collided with, an animation ending, and all that kind of stuff. They can be connected to methods and other nodes through the editor to allow for communication amongst the nodes without creating coupling. Here's a diagram of what coupling means. The way I understand it is that so many objects are holding hands that if one node falls, it takes the others down with them. Signals are like a high five. Gets the job done, way less reliance on each other, boom. Signals. Makes the coding experience much nicer. Moving on. Before I delve into Godot's 3D, I want to briefly mention its physics, since it's kind of a combination of code and 3D. Also 2D, but I didn't deal with a lot of 2D physics, so I won't be bringing it up. The physics system isn't bad, but it isn't always great. I found that physics can be quite jittery on a smaller scale. Oftentimes collision-related signals won't work, and things move just a little weirdly. When translating movement and shooting physics from a game I made on Unity into Godot, I noticed it felt off. Even after tons of fine-tuning, the physics felt off. I can't tell if it felt too floaty or too heavy or if the acceleration was wrong, but every time I used physics, it just felt a little off. That's probably on me, but I never felt that way in Unity or Unreal. Here's something cool though. In Godot, you can have non-convex colliders on rigid bodies and kinematic bodies, and it works. I haven't dived too deep into this territory, but I see realistic, non-glitchy behavior. I use this for a little sequence where a spaceship flies in and you can jump around on it while it idles. And you know what? There was no jittering, no lagging, no clipping, no crashing, nothing. Yet despite working, Godot kept warning me not to use it for such purposes. It's dumb. Why not? What if I want to be cool, huh? In Unity, when you try to do this, the object falls to the floor and an error tells you that the functionality is deprecated. Whatever, Unity's favorite word is deprecated. The last thing to mention about physics is that it's kind of weird to deal with code-wise. The two main methods that interact with physics bodies are physics process, the equivalent of fixed update in Unity, and integrate forces. Some physics variables can only be changed in physics process, and some can only be changed in integrate forces, and I never know which one is which. If you try to change a physics variable in the wrong method, nothing happens. And sometimes, the way you change a variable is different for physics bodies than for non-physics bodies. If you want to change the position of a rigid body, for example, you must use state.transform.origin in the integrate forces method. I still struggle with physics coding constantly, but I usually get it working mostly how I intended. Anyway, that's the extent of my thoughts on Godot's physics. 3D navigation works well. Initially, the controls felt a bit abrupt, but I quickly figured out all the hotkeys and adjustments and now prefer it to Unity. While Unity's editor camera is far smoother to maneuver, the snappy start and stop of Godot's ensures that my view never accidentally slips past an object. Though this can all be changed in editor settings if you want it to be more like to Unity. Matter of fact, all of this can be changed in editor settings. Controls, gizmos, and other stuff I've forgotten. It's awesome. The only way to select objects in the editor, besides using the hierarchy, is by using select mode, which I prefer to Unity, where you might accidentally select an object while trying to drag another. You can also enable the switch or use Alt and right mouse to get a list of all the objects at the location you're clicking. Better yet, you can press a button that will make sure that when clicking a child node, like a mesh or collider, that the parent will automatically be selected instead. Of course, there's snapping, multiple methods of manually updating position / rotation and scale, and of course a snap to floor option, which is very handy for keeping your scene grounded. Pun intended. In Godot, all of your post-processing, tone mapping, fog, ambient occlusion, and other background stuff is located in the World Environment node. You can only have one of these running at a time, but you can swap them out and they contain pretty much every setting needed to make your game look good. Godot's 3D functionality is awesome. There are a lot of options for making your game look however you want, though most of us Godot devs will stick to emulating retro 3D graphics, thank you very much. Shaders come with all kinds of checkboxes. Transparency, shadows, unshaded, built-in triplanar mapping, with several customization options, different diffuse modes, specular modes, blend modes, culling, billboard mode, proximity and distance fade. Sick! I have no need for a lot of this, but because it is here, I want to use it anyway. And I want to use it incorrectly because it's fun and it has inspired my creativity. There's all kinds of 3D nodes I haven't touched yet, but sure as hell plan to. Navigation and navigation meshes, spring arms and vehicle wheels. A lot of occlusion related things, lights, light probes, 3D sprites. Actually, those I have used. They're basically billboards, but they are simple to set up, have a lot of customization options, and work well. Immediate geometry, for when you just can't wait. VR! Godot supports VR. I haven't done much with VR besides putting myself into a level I made, but it works. And it's pretty easy to set up, even I could do it. That's not to mention everything else hiding in here, just waiting to be messed with. But with all this excitement, I of course must mention some of the annoyances I have. Importing is a little weird. You import the mesh, which then needs to be opened as a scene and saved as basically just that, an open meshed scene. And then you can make that a child of the object it represents. Sometimes you can skip the third step and just tinker with the open mesh, but Godot restricts just how much you can do that. With a well-organized file structure, it's fine, but always a little cumbersome. Re-importing meshes is kind of weird too. It works, but it will take up to several minutes before the changes actually update, both in editor and in-game. And restarting Godot doesn't fix this immediately. It always updates eventually, but it's still rather annoying. What doesn't update, however, are mesh collisions. You can generate a mesh collision by selecting the mesh, pressing the mesh button, and picking from a number of collision generation options. I take this, cut and paste it into the main physics body node, and make sure everything is scaled correctly. But if you modify the mesh and re-import it, you have to regenerate your collision node every time, and it can be a bit of a hassle. To quickly defer back to things I like about 3D, this feature isn't a solution by any means, but it's one hell of a sorry. If you go to Project, Tools, Export GLTF, you can export the current node and all of its children as a 3D file, and then use that as a reference for making models in something like Blender. Of course, it doesn't retain its script data, but nevertheless, it's extremely helpful for modeling. I used it heavily for my platforming game. Once I'd made measurements for the optimal platform distances and sizes, I brought the test layout into Blender and traced around the measurements. But that's enough praise. Back to things I don't like, because I must complain. 3D audio. It kind of sucks in my opinion. By default, the Audio Stream Player 3D node, that's a mouthful, has an attenuation filter applied. That makes audio sound more muffled the farther away it is. But it sounds bad, and I always turn it off by cranking the cutoff hertz to its peak. Even still, the spatial audio sounds weird. Going from the left speaker to the right feels way too dramatic, and listening to something coming from one side will make the opposite speaker completely silent. Unity's felt more natural and balanced by default, though I do like that Godot is a little louder. I also found that Godot's audio is more prone to popping at the end of sound effects. I fixed this by ensuring that I faded out all of my audio tracks in Audacity, but it seems kind of odd that I never noticed this in Unity. Earlier I mentioned that the shaders have a lot of options, which is good, but shaders and 3D rendering aren't always the best. Firstly, depth-related glitches are a constant problem, especially when getting custom shaders involved. I'm always toggling different transparency and occlusion settings and making sure that things are rendered in the right order. Also, shaders lag like hell when they are first loaded. You'll rarely see it in the editor because they're loaded as soon as it's open, but when running an exported build, it's bad. Frozen screen, stuttering audio, tearing, depending on how many shaders you have and the power of your computer, this can last several seconds. My basic understanding is that the game is waiting until the shader appears on screen before it actually compiles the shader code, which is what causes the holdup. This is a planned fix to my knowledge, and workarounds are possible, but they are arduous to set up. I know I filled your ears with complaints, but this gross shader lag is the one and only part of Godot that actually makes me wince. It's embarrassing seeing my computer freeze because a little polygonal robot had too many colors for it to handle. Most other 3D bugs I found have to do with WebGL and Mac builds of my games. They don't seem to handle Godot's 3D very well, but hopefully the new Vulkan rendering will fix some of this. In summary, 3D options, navigation, variety, great, incredible, fantastic even. 3D working, keeping itself together, not always so great. But to say that Godot is incapable of making 3D games is ridiculous. Even now, it just needs a little more optimization than other engines. Nothing drastic. So, 2D. I don't use it often, I'm just more of a 3D guy. But I have used it a little, so I'll talk briefly about my thoughts on it. Firstly, Godot's 2D works on a completely different family of nodes than 3D, meaning that the two don't really interact with each other outside of signals and references. If you want to combine 2D and 3D elements in the Octopath Traveler style, you'll probably end up doing everything in 3D using Sprite 3D and Animated Sprite 3D nodes, which work great. None of this is a knock against Godot. Having 2D and 3D completely separate means that it is far easier to code for both, and even to make games that utilize the difference. Most 3D nodes have a 2D equivalent and vice versa, but the 2D arsenal has some really neat nodes of its own. Things like Y-sort for making sprites go in front of or behind each other, a parallax node, polygon 2D, navigation, lights, and more. The reason that they are considered different from the 3D counterpart all has to do with the in-engine separation. They function in two different worlds. In Unity, you would still have to use vector 3s to make 2D objects move, which led to a lot of conversion being required to switch back and forth. But Godot's 2D code is programmed for 2D stuff. Vector 2s, normal sounding variable names, that kind of thing. And Godot is ideal for pixelated games too. It has a number of settings for screen scaling that allow the game to fill a monitor while still rendering at a lower resolution. Best part is that this works for 2D and 3D, meaning that all parts of your game will render at the same resolution. Same can't be said for Unity's render texture solution, which is tedious to set up and lacking in configurability. Unity's 2D seems like it was an afterthought, but Godot's got 2D in its DNA. Once again, I haven't dived too deep into the 2D side of things, but what I have seen, I have lauded. However, I have used the GUI system quite a bit, so I can touch on that. Everything GUI related is housed within the green control family of nodes. And let me tell you, the control family is a big one. Unity has about 20 different components for fulfilling your UI needs. But I counted, and Godot has 56, from pop-up windows, aspect ratio containers, and color pickers, to 9 kinds of button, different sliders, scroll bars, progress bars, item lists, tabs, a video player. There is a lot to choose from, and most of it works right out of the box. At least initially. Getting into the nitty-gritty, I did find the abundance of options confusing at some times. Anchor, margin, grow direction, rect. There are a lot of options for placing and scaling UI elements, but I can never seem to get it to work how I'd like, especially in regards to elements that adjust based on screen aspect ratio. But that isn't a Godot-specific problem. I just find UI design confusing in general. Dealing with fonts is kind of weird though. The default font sucks. It's tiny and not adjustable in any way, including size. When you import a font, you have to save it as another kind of file before it can be referenced. Even as a reference, the nodes seem to prefer that you use a theme for defining their look. And the theme builder is great. It's a little suite that allows you to change the properties of every button, slider, and text box that you'll come across. But with the complexity of all the UI elements compounded, it can be very confusing to make specific design changes. I'm not sure if I should check the import settings on the actual font, the settings on the file it was converted to, the theme input area, or the theme override area that also includes a font input. If you're not careful, you can get lost in a nest of nodes, though insanity appears to be the nature of GUI development in general. Yet, I still found menu development fun, and making menus isn't something I've historically found fun, or even bothered to do at all. Is the documentation bad? Well, yeah, but not in an abnormal way. It's just as bad as any other game engine documentation, too few details, a lot of missing features, etc. It's certainly not notably bad, just could do with a bit more of itself. I like how it's structured though. If something is there, it's pretty easy to find through a web search, and the pages are organized in a way that makes sense and is easy to bounce between details. There's also integration of the documentation within Godot itself. Many lines can be looked up with a quick right click. When people say the documentation is bad, I think what they really mean is that the quantity and quality of online solutions is lacking. In every engine I've used, the most helpful answers were not from the documentation, but from forums. Because Godot has a smaller community, especially in the case of people learning 3D, relevant answers have been few and far between. A lot of unanswered inquiries, outdated responses from earlier versions, and sometimes just straight up wrong answers for some reason. With the seeming barren desert of information and the fact that Google seems to be mocking me with its Unity equivalent answers constantly popping up alongside, it's no wonder why people come away from their Google search with a rather negative impression of Godot's online resources. But I assure you, to this point, I have always found a way to make Godot do what I want. Sometimes it's extremely roundabout and inconvenient, but it's a solution nonetheless. Either way, if the documentation and forums aren't giving you an answer, I've had quite a bit of luck with the Godot Discord. I swing in, type out my problem, provide some version information and a screenshot, and usually some other member, far wiser than I, will pop in and help sort out my predicament. The Godot community is very supportive, very helpful, and very understanding. I often felt looked down upon by people in the Unity forums and on Discord. But with Godot, the attitude is different. They're people making games, making software. They're not trying to be the elite masters of the game dev world. They know that the program isn't industry standard. They know that not everybody's at the same knowledge level. The whole approach is one from a more artistic point of view than from a technical nerd point of view. And I'm not saying that Godot folk don't know their material, not at all. But the way they approach approach interacting with those less experienced is honest, humble, and supportive. This kind of attitude seems rather rare in the tech groups, with open source software forums being the place I see it most often. At least that's been my experience, but I digress. The point is, documentation will never be perfect, and online support will never be perfect, but it can get better. If more people join the Godot community and express their despair in the forums and we all find solutions together, it becomes a better experience for everyone. Documentation aside, Godot has plenty of tutorials. Not Unity levels of plenty, not even close, but certainly enough to get you to the point of familiarity with Godot. I personally started with Complete Your First Complete 3D Game with Godot by GD Quest, and Godot Action RPG series by Heartbeast, which were great introductions to the Godot workflow and many of its features. From then on, I got most of my video-based learning from people like Miziziz, Bastion Olai, gamedev, Play with Furcifer, Kids Can Code, and others whose names have slipped my mind. At a certain point, you stop watching tutorial series and just watch one-off tutorials on shaders, saving and loading, and those smaller pieces of game development. My past experience with other game engines made the tutorial phase rather brief, but through these tutorials, I began to discover the greater Godot community. For the sake of time, I'll have to save my disquisition on the many wonderful people and projects of the community for another day, but if you're in the Godot community, please share some cool projects and people for everyone else and I to check out, and maybe share some resources that helped you learn Godot. I would like to briefly mention Godot's platform compatibility. It runs on Windows, Mac, Linux, and apparently on the web just fine and dandy, and it exports to Windows, Mac, Linux, and HTML5 with varying degrees of success. Windows exports work great. Not really much to say. You get a folder with 2 files in it, and somehow that's enough to run the game. Linux works, I think. I've submitted a Linux build in all of my Game Jam entries and never had anyone say that it didn't work, so that's good, I think. I don't have Linux. But I do have a Mac, and Mac is iffy. I find for simple 2D and even 3D games it works fine, but if you start turning on the post-processing, AO, SSF, or even add too many lights, it'll act up and display incorrectly. WebGL is a similar story. If you're uploading a web build, go easy on the graphics. Here's something funny I noticed about the combination of macOS and WebGL. Nothing. The game does not run on Mac through WebGL whatsoever. I've tried it on my Mac, family members' Macs, and even heard from a Mac owner in the comments. It does not appear to work for whatever reason. Could be that I'm using GLS3 for rendering. Could be something else. I have not taken the time to fix it. Now, you may have noticed that I didn't list PlayStation, Switch, or Ouya on that list of export devices. You probably already know why, but just in case, here's the skinny. Godot is open source, meaning people can see the code that makes it up. Console companies giving out their software development kits don't want everybody to see the code inside. Trade secrets, security concerns, whatever. It's a conflict of interest. Now, if you want to contact the console companies yourself and sign an NDA for the SDK or pay somebody to port for you, you may, but Godot can't support those platforms out of the box. Unlike Unity that does support those platforms out of the box. Or did. You have to pay for those now. Maybe you're best off with Unreal. So long as they don't go to war with another platform again. Well. Porting to consoles is always going to be hard, regardless of whether or not the engine says it can do it. If you really want your Godot game on Switch, you can make it happen. My conclusion, my thesis, and my point is that I really like Godot. Yeah, I know I spent half the video complaining about it, but I seriously love the program. I also really like Unity, but Unity's packages and deprecated assets and overabundance of systems makes me feel like I don't have control over my game. One day I'll open it up and something will be broken, an asset will be deprecated, a system will have fundamentally changed, and my journey to understand it all will reset. Every project I make in Unity feels fragile. A single press of a button or a flick of a switch could render the whole thing unusable. And Unreal Engine is just too much for my brain and computer to handle. But Godot's deceptively simple, compact workflow, clean interfacing, and ease of use makes it far more appealing to me. I feel like I made the game, that I have complete control of the project, if that makes any sense. And on a more personal and perhaps petty note, it seems like Godot and the names behind it care more about the people using the software. When I see Unity investing in massive technologies and adding tons of features that the average developer wouldn't ever use, while the common tools are constantly becoming obsolete and then being replaced by new ones that are incomplete, I can't help but feel left out of Unity's advancement. Godot and open source software in general is very grounded. The people making the software are the same people using it. There's communication, there's community, there's understanding, and there's this thing that everyone is a part of, that everyone contributes to. That's what I really like about Godot. And that's why I want to keep using it. I want to keep the conversation going. What are your thoughts on Godot? What are your thoughts on other game engines? What do you value when making that choice? And the video, what did you agree with? What did you disagree with? And what did I get wrong perhaps? I'd really like to know. Also, if you're in the Godot community, who are some of your favorite creators and what are some projects that deserve some attention? Heck, let me know what you're working on. And thank you for watching. Maybe I'll see you at 1,000 hours. Ciao for now.